Chapter 1 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 4, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 1, Fort Pickens Reenforced. Military and naval expeditions rarely move at their first appointed time. That prepared by Captain Fox for Sumter was, by the President's order, directed to sail on April 6, but did not actually start till the 9th. That prepared by Captain Meigs for Pickens was to have got off on the 2nd, but only sailed on the 6th. The fitting out of both went on simultaneously at New York, but the officers concerned were not cognizant of each other's plans and measures. The sudden activity and work at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and at some of the public docks filled the newspapers with all sorts of surmises, but the secrets of the government were not disclosed. "A powerful naval and military force sails today from this port," said the Tribune, "to reinforce and protect the United States possessions in the South. The Collins steamships Atlantic and Baltic and the Vanderbilt steamer Illinois have been chartered, and in company with the frigate Powhatan will soon be on the high seas, bearing ample supplies of men and provisions to the point most in danger. Whether that point be Pickens or Sumter, we cannot at present say." This statement was perfectly sincere. The reporters obtained nothing except such evidence as it was impossible to conceal from the public. Most of all, however, were the rebels mystified by these preparations. It has frequently been loosely charged that all the earlier orders and movements of the war were divulged by enemies and spies in the Washington departments. This is entirely erroneous. From the 2nd to the 8th of April, telegrams were passing daily from the rebel commissioners in Washington to the Montgomery authorities, but they contained absolutely nothing except the reports of these public observations and the vague rumors and guesses afloat on the streets. These dispatches show a curious fluctuation of rumors. Thus, on the 2nd, the warning was, "Watch at all points." On the 3rd, report says these movements have reference to the San Domingo question. On the 4th, strengthen the defenses at the mouth of the Mississippi, to which Toombs responded, "We are ready." On the 5th, an important move requiring a formidable military and naval force is certainly on foot. The statement that the armament is intended for San Domingo may be a mere ruse. On the 6th, the rumors that they are destined to use against Pickens and perhaps Sumter are getting every day stronger. We know nothing positive on the subject. On the 7th, it may be Sumter and the Mississippi. It is almost certain that it is Pickens and the Texas frontier. Even on the 8th, they were as ignorant as at the beginning, and telegraphed to Toombs, "We believe Fort Pickens and Texas are the first points of military demonstration." By this time, the governor of South Carolina was in a fever of anxiety and had asked from Charleston, "We have so many extraordinary telegrams. I would be glad to know from you if it is true that they have determined to reinforce Sumter, and if a naval force is sent to our harbor. Be so good as to answer as soon as convenient, for something is desired to govern our conduct." Their reply to him is ludicrously oracular and inaccurate. "We are assured that you will not be disturbed without notice, and we think Sumter is to be evacuated and Pickens provisioned." The success of the government in keeping its secrets is most conclusively shown in the fact that the first trustworthy news received by the commissioners at Washington came to them from Charleston in a dispatch signed by General Beauregard, who telegraphed, "Special messenger from Lincoln, Mr. Chew, informs us Sumter to be provisioned peaceably, otherwise forcibly." 4 days and nights of incessant work at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and at 2 o'clock on the 5th of April, the war steamer Powhatan was ready for sea. The crew boarded their ship with cheers. The officers assembled in uniform on the quarter deck. Commandant Andrew H. Foote, afterwards Rear Admiral, formally turned over the vessel to her captain, the ensign was hoisted, and the Powhatan declared in commission for a special cruise. About the same time that afternoon, the Secretary of the Navy at Washington was signing an order constituting the Powhatan the flagship and Captain Mercer the naval commander of the Sumter expedition, and giving him directions to convoy the provisions and troops to Charleston, and in case their landing was refused and opposed, then to open a way to the fort by force. This order reached Mercer on the next day, the 6th of April, and he was about to proceed in its execution when Lieutenant Porter presented himself on board and showed him the order signed by President Lincoln directing that Lieutenant D.D. Porter will take command of the steamer Powhatan, or any other U.S. steamer ready for sea which he may deem most fit for the service to which he has been assigned by confidential instructions of this date. All officers are commanded to afford him all such facilities as he may deem necessary for getting to sea as soon as possible. Another letter to Mercer, also signed by the President, explained to him that he was for a special purpose detached, but without any reflection on his efficiency or patriotism, and expressed the hope of giving him a better command. Here was an evident cross purpose. Meigs was called into council, and the three officers discussed and criticized the conflicting orders. Meigs insisted that the President's signature was the higher authority. This both detached Mercer and placed Porter in command. Mercer was loath to depart from his ship, but at length correctly construed his duty and yielded, reporting to the Secretary of the Navy, "Your confidential instructions of the 5th instant were received on the next day, and I was on the eve of carrying them out when Lieutenant D.D. Porter of the Navy and Captain Meigs of the Army came to me, showing such written instructions from the President and verbally communicating other facts showing their authority from this high source, that Lieutenant Porter's being placed in command of the Powhatan was virtually necessary, and that the President's positive commands to both of these officers were that no deviation from his instructions should be made unless by his own direction. Under these circumstances, I regarded the order from the President of the United States as imperative, and accordingly placed Lieutenant Porter in command of the Powhatan." That evening Porter steamed down the bay, but his successful departure was destined to run yet another hazard. Before the contest about the ship was concluded, he and Meigs had telegraphed to Washington. Mr. Seward, to whom their message was addressed, carried it to the Secretary of the Navy, but that official, in the absence of any knowledge, could not interfere, and they were therefore both compelled to go to the President. Mr. Welles says, "The President, who had not retired, although it was nearly midnight, was astonished and perplexed in regard to the statements which we made. He looked first at one and then at the other, read and reread the telegram, and asked if I was not in error in regard to the flagship. I assured him I was not, and reminded him that I had read to him my orders to Captain Mercer on the day they were written, and they had met his approval. He recollected that circumstance, but not the name of the officer or the vessel, said he had become confused with the names of Pocahontas and Powhatan. Commodore Stringham, to whom I had communicated the instructions, confirmed my statement, but to satisfy the President beyond peradventure, I went to the department, although it was past midnight, and procured the press copy." On reading it, he distinctly recollected all the facts, and turning promptly to Mr. Seward, said the Powhatan must be restored to Mercer, that he had never supposed he was interfering with the Sumter expedition, that on no consideration should it be defeated or rendered abortive. Mr. Seward thought it was now too late to correct the mistake, said he considered the other project the most important, and asked whether that would not be injured if the Powhatan was now withdrawn. The President would not discuss the subject, but was peremptory, and said there was not the pressing necessity in the other case, which I learned was an enterprise for Pickens. As regarded Sumter, however, not a day was to be lost. that the orders of the Secretary of the Navy must be carried out, and he directed Mr. Seward to telegraph to that effect to New York without a moment's delay. Mr. Seward thought it might be difficult to get a telegram through, it was so late, but the President was imperative. Seward obeyed the President's direction and immediately sent the following to Porter: "Give up the Powhatan to Mercer. Seward." When this dispatch was received at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the Powhatan was already some hours on her way. Nevertheless, Foote hurried a swift tug in pursuit, which overtook the ship. But when Porter read the dispatch and saw that it was only signed Seward, he was not slow to avail himself of the same superior authority of the President over the Secretary of State that he had used over the Secretary of the Navy. He paid no attention to the telegram, but continued his voyage to Fort Pickens. Early next morning, Captain Meigs, in the merchant steamer Atlantic, with supplies and a portion of the force of 700 men under Colonel Brown, sailed for the same destination, another ship, the Illinois, with the remainder following a day later. Lincoln's peremptory direction to Seward to detain the Powhatan if possible was based upon information received that afternoon. It will be remembered that Scott's order to land Vogdes's company at Fort Pickens was dispatched by sea on March 12, and that the non-receipt of any answer from it had caused the President great uneasiness. On this same afternoon of April 6, a special messenger reached the Navy Department, who, on being ushered into the Secretary's presence while yet dusty and travel-worn, unstrapped a belt from beneath his garments and took out an official dispatch from the fleet at Pensacola, which by journeying day and night he had brought over the Southern railroads from Florida to Washington. This dispatch brought serious news. Scott's order, sent March 12, encountered such delays that it only reached the fleet April 1. Vogdes, in compliance, asked for immediate means to land, but Captain H.A. Adams, commanding the fleet, refused, alleging that it was a violation of the joint order of Holt and Toucey, made in consequence of the Pickens and Sumter truce between Buchanan and certain Southern senators on January 29. Scott's army order, Adams held, could not supersede Secretary Toucey's Navy order. He therefore sent an officer to solicit the express commands of the department, explaining in justification, "Such a step is too important to be taken without the clearest orders from proper authority. It would certainly be viewed as a hostile act and would be resisted to the utmost. No one acquainted with the feelings of the military assembled under General Bragg can doubt that it would be considered not only a declaration but an act of war. It would be a serious thing to bring on by any precipitation a collision which may be entirely against the wishes of the Administration. At present, both sides are faithfully observing the agreement entered into by the United States Government with Mr. Mallory and Colonel Chase. This agreement binds us not to reenforce Fort Pickens unless it shall be attacked or threatened. It binds them not to attack it unless we should attempt to reenforce it. I saw General Bragg on the 30th ultimo, who reassured me the conditions on their part should not be violated. While I cannot take on myself, under such insufficient authority as General Scott's order, the fearful responsibility of an act which seems to render civil war inevitable, I am ready at all times to carry out whatever orders I may receive from the Honorable the Secretary of the Navy." Deeply mortifying as was this action of Captain Adams in so urgent a contingency, there was such earnest sincerity in the tone of his letter, such conscientious technical obedience to his by this time antiquated instructions, such a manly offer to carry out any new orders of the Government coming through direct and regular channels as to disarm all reproach. But mere chagrin was swallowed up in the sense of the new perils created by this condition of affairs so tardily revealed. Since Fort Pickens was still exposed to capture, the Sumter expedition was doubly important. Meanwhile, every nerve must be strained to get proper orders to Pensacola before Bragg should obtain information of it. As the result of a few hurried inquiries, a young naval officer, then comparatively unknown, but afterwards of brilliant renown, Lieutenant John L. Worden, was summoned before Secretary Welles. He was told to prepare for a difficult, perhaps dangerous journey in the few hours to elapse before the next train started southward from the capital. Mr. Welles gave him a brief and unsealed written order which Worden committed to memory before reaching Richmond, and then destroyed the writing to ensure absolute secrecy. He took the cars at Washington on the morning of April 7. The notes of alarm from Washington and New York had put the Montgomery authorities on the alert, but their ignorance of where the threatened blow might fall confused and paralyzed their preparations to ward it off. Sumter was their first care, Pickens next. On April 3, the rebel Secretary of War inquired of Bragg whether he had made any progress in preparations to attack. Bragg's reply of the 5th said, "We are prepared for defense," then added, "Should the agreement not to reinforce be violated, may I attack?" Explanations were asked, and he thereupon stated his views more in detail. From these it appears that as an excuse to violate the agreement, he had invented the pretext that an engineer officer had been placed in the fort. This he intended to construe as being a reinforcement. He himself felt the plea to be so weak as to need the concurrent sanction of the authorities. The weather had seemed about to furnish him the opportunity for attack, for he explained, "A strong easterly wind was blowing, calculated to drive off the United States naval vessels. It continues yet, but they hold on, though evidently with trouble. I am not prepared with my batteries for anything more than a feeble defense, and that condition cannot be changed until I can get supplies. The only attack which I could hope to make now would be a sudden dash, distracting the enemy by a false attack, and scaling the walls in an opposite direction. The weakness of the garrison and the ardor and ignorance of my troops would be strong elements of success. In this movement I should not propose to fire a gun unless in the diversion." But the elements did not render him the aid he had anticipated. The following day he was obliged to report by telegraph, "The blow is over and the vessels stood it out." Meantime, the Montgomery authorities had received news of Lincoln's notice of the departure of the expedition and of the sudden blight which had fallen upon the Washington mission, and there was something of a panic along the whole seaboard. Troops and munitions were hurried to Pensacola, and Bragg was admonished to be on the defensive. "Our commissioners at Washington have received a flat refusal," telegraphed Walker April 8, and again in a later dispatch of the same date, "The expression 'at all hazards' in my dispatch of this morning was not intended to require you to land upon the island. The presumption is that reinforcements will be attempted at the dock, and this I hope you can and will prevent, though it should lead to assault of your works. The belief here is that they will not only attempt to reinforce the fort, but also to retake the Navy Yard." To obtain Fort Pickens by arms and valor was for the moment despaired of, and instead, if we may credit the official dispatches, a subtler agency was called into requisition. Bragg had already reported, "Finally, I have reason to believe the garrison in Fort Pickens is greatly demoralized by influences which are operating strongly in our favor." This was as much as he dared to trust on paper, and he sent a special messenger to Montgomery to obtain a corruption fund. Secession was ready to employ questionable expedients, and Walker telegraphed April 9, "Captain Boggs left here this morning to join you. $40,000 are at your disposal to be used in the way he suggested to me as coming from you. Although he has no instructions on that point, as it escaped me in the hurry of his departure, you will, however, understand. But it usually happens that such a plan is more easily devised than executed. "Shall try to use the money," answered Bragg, "but great vigilance is exercised. They fear their own men." Upon whom these mercenary influences were to be tried does not appear, but the sequel proves that here, as in Texas, the Union soldiers were proof against bribery. Lieutenant Worden, meanwhile, traveling southward, arrived at Pensacola on the morning of April 11. He made known his presence as an officer of the United States Navy, and applied to General Bragg for permission to communicate with the fleet, a right which the agreement of January 29 had distinctly reserved. "He wrote me a pass," says Worden, "authorizing me to go to the Sabine, and upon handing it to me he asked if I had dispatches for Captain Adams. I replied that I had not written ones, but that I had a verbal communication to make to him from the Navy Department. I then asked him if I would be permitted to land on my return towards Washington. He replied that I would, provided Captain Adams or myself did nothing in violation of the agreement existing between them. I remarked that I knew nothing of the agreement he mentioned." It must have been a most tantalizing delay to Worden, pending these delicate and hazardous formalities. The day was rapidly wearing away. 4 o'clock in the afternoon came before he was able to embark for the Wyandotte, lying in the harbor, and doing duty as a dispatch boat for the fleet, which lay anchored in the open roadstead outside. Still greater, however, was probably his impatience when, informed by the commander of that vessel that the strong wind and rough sea would prevent his crossing the bar that night. Even next morning the sea was yet too dangerous. It was already high noon when he crossed the bar and mounted to the deck of the Sabine. He at once communicated the order to Captain Adams, and that commander, anxious to send return news to Washington, and incautiously confiding in the terms of the agreement, which reserved his right and that of the other officers in command at Pensacola freely to communicate with the Government by special messenger, ordered him again to land at Pensacola, which he did at 5 p.m., to return by rail as he had come, a mistake in judgment which cost Worden 7 months of imprisonment. As he had promised to do, Captain Adams promptly executed Secretary Welles's order to land the troops on the first favorable opportunity. That same night, April 12, the boats of the squadron carried the artillery company of Captain Israel Bogdas, 86 men, and a detachment of 115 marines from the fleet to a convenient landing on the outside beach of Santa Rosa Island. The night was dark, and the rebels had early that evening extinguished the beacon, but the movement was effected without accident or delay, and before the enemy was even aware of it, the peril of Fort Pickens was substantially warded off by this reinforcement to its garrison. How narrowly this success was obtained, the rebel correspondence demonstrates. Soon after Bragg had given Worden his pass, he received the important intelligence: "Beauregard has been ordered to demand the immediate evacuation of Fort Sumter. If refused, his batteries will open fire." Yet more startling news was telegraphed him next day, April 12, from the rebel War Department. "Lieutenant Worden of the United States Navy has gone to Pensacola with dispatches. Intercept them." Another dispatch was also sent, prompting him to attack Pickens. Bragg was forced to reply that the order came too late. "Mr. Worden had communicated with the fleet before your dispatch was received. Alarm guns have just fired at Fort Pickens. I fear the news is received and it will be reinforced before morning. It cannot be prevented." The next morning, April 13, he was further compelled to confirm these apprehensions. "Reinforcements," he wrote, "thrown into Fort Pickens last night by small boats from the outside. The movement could not even be seen from our side, but was discovered by a small reconnoitering boat. It does not redound to the credit of the rebel authorities that they vented their impotent rage at this result upon Lieutenant Worden. He was arrested at Montgomery, imprisoned, and only released by exchange 7 months afterwards." While these events were occurring, the Powhatan under Porter and the transport Atlantic under Meigs, together with her companion ship, the Illinois, were separately making their way to the scene of action. The rebels were as yet entirely in the dark as to their objective point, though their departure from New York was evidently known. Some adventurous spirits at Mobile assumed that the Illinois was bound to the coast of Texas, and obtained authority from the rebel Secretary of War to arm a steamer at New Orleans as a privateer and undertake her capture. But as her voyage did not extend as far as the mouth of the Mississippi, she was in no danger from the undertaking, even if it was carried out. Meigs in the Atlantic reached Key West on the morning of the 13th, where he stopped to execute an important political mission with which he was charged. Key West, though situated upon an island only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, was nevertheless the most important as well as most populous town of Florida, its 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants being then occupied in marine salvage, in commerce, in sponge fisheries, in salt production, in the various employments incidental to an active shipping industry, and the maintenance of a large government naval station. It has a fine harbor, defended by Fort Taylor, a powerful work which here to a great extent controls the commerce of this part of the world, as it guards the principal entrance to the Gulf of Mexico through the dangerous navigation of the Florida reefs. Garrisoned by only a feeble company in the earlier stages of secession, the foresight of General Scott had somewhat strengthened the post in January, but the population of the town, naturally taking on the prevalent hue of Southern sentiment, was already seriously warped from its duty and allegiance to the government. Here, as elsewhere, Unionism was silenced and secessionism emboldened by the demoralizing Buchanan policy. To correct this state of feeling and to avert these dangers, Meigs brought with him commissions for several newly appointed Federal officials, together with the President's authority to the military commandant to proclaim martial law, should that measure become necessary. Judge Marvin of the United States District Court and the new collector, Navy agent, and marshal were called together at the fort, where Meigs explained to them, greatly to their relief and satisfaction, the policy and determination of the government, and thus reassured in faith and strengthened in authority, they promised to hold treason and revolution in check, a promise which they faithfully kept. It was high time for the government to make its presence felt, for already a secession flag flew over the courthouse within musket shot of Fort Taylor, and only the exercise of martial law, soon thereafter proclaimed, crushed the budding rebellion and maintained the Union authority at that important point. The mission fulfilled, Meigs continued his voyage, and on the 17th came in sight of the fleet anchored off Fort Pickens. Prompt communication was had with Captain Adams, and before midnight 200 men were landed from the Atlantic and added to the garrison. While this work was being continued, the next morning, April 18th, the Powhatan hove in sight, disguised as much as possible, wearing English colors and burning English coal. Colonel Harvey Brown, who had taken command of the fort, hereupon sent word to Meigs that in the present condition of affairs, the original plan agreed upon at Washington had better be abandoned, that in the unprepared state of Fort Pickens it would be disastrous to bring on a collision, that the running of the gauntlet by Porter would do this inevitably. Meigs fully concurred in this opinion, and being at the moment on board the Wyandotte, vigorously made signals to convey this understanding to the newcomer. But the Powhatan, in her role of an English steamer, paid no attention whatever to these American signals, and headed her course with unabated speed for the entrance of the harbor. Meigs knew both the ship and the headstrong temper of her commander. Porter, he felt sure, had made up his mind to run the batteries, and unaware of the changed and improved condition of the fort, would not be turned aside from this purpose by any ordinary notice. Quickly taking his measures, therefore, he ordered the Wyandotte to advance and lay exactly across the course of the Powhatan, and thus brought the impulsive Porter to a dead halt, lest he should run down a Union ship, and that only when the two vessels were within speaking distance, where Meigs could verbally explain the reason for the apparently reckless proceeding. 2 more days passed, and Meigs and his brother officers began to grow uneasy about the Illinois, when she too made her appearance in safety. With the reinforcements brought by the Meigs expedition, Fort Pickens now contained some 1,100 men, soldiers, and laborers. Nearly reaching the estimated war garrison the work was capable of holding, together with 6 months' supplies. The safety of the fort was fully assured, the fleet yet remaining to aid in its defense, and though beleaguered for a time, the flag of the Union floated over its ramparts during the whole of the Civil War. End of chapter 1.